Hello everyone. So this is the third video lecture of week 4, and in this lecture we're going to talk about the city of Uruk and the beginning of urbanization in southern Mesopotamia. And in that context we're also going to look at how architecture and monumental architecture is kind of really changing and being involved in this urbanization process. Previously, in the previous lecture, we looked at the regional cultures of the Chalcolithic, particularly in northern and southern Mesopotamia, and these different regional cultures forming and shaping around particular ceramic technologies, particular ceramic styles, figurine styles, and house cultures. This time we're really moving ahead towards the end of the Chalcolithic period in the 4th millennium, towards the end of the 4th millennium, and looking at a very specific process of the emergence of the first cities. And the emergence of the first cities is really associated with a whole set of really social and cultural changes in Mesopotamia, including the invention of writing, the emergence of monumental architecture in this urban context, formation of ceremonial centers, redesign of the entire economy of the society. So with the division of labor, establishment of the interregional trade, and so on. So we're going to see how this process is working out, and particularly the archaeological evidence points out two important centers in the very beginning of that process, and one is Uruk on the Euphrates, and the other is Nippur. Our archaeological evidence, our concrete evidence for the development of the very early phases of the city comes from Uruk. So I'm just going to focus on Uruk, but we will return to Nippur next week, or in the coming weeks, because Nippur later also becomes a rather important Mesopotamian city in the coming weeks. But let's talk a little bit about this idea of the urban revolution. The idea of urban revolution is put up against this idea of the second revolution after the agricultural revolution, the domestication of plants and animals that we talked about in previous lectures and weeks. But this idea of urban revolution, the emergence of first cities, really is introduced by this Australian archaeologist Gordon Childe in the book that he wrote published in 1936, Man Makes Himself, where he discussed this process of small kin-based societies and non-literate agricultural villages transform into kind of large, socially complex urban societies. And he tried to kind of theorize and understand this process and how it related to the invention of writing. The other interesting writer who is influential in thinking about the first cities in Mesopotamia and elsewhere is Paul Wheatley, and the book that he wrote, Four Quarters, a preliminary inquiry into the origins and character of the ancient Chinese city. Although he was writing about the ancient Chinese city, he was writing it in a comparative way, so he was also talking about Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, Egypt, the Nile Valley, and the Indus Valley in South Asia, having similar processes as the Yellow River Valley in China. And his argument was that the first cities was really developed around ceremonial centers, and that people actually came together. The beginning of the cities were really happened around temples or ceremonial centers, and he actually illustrates this by comparing different kinds of cities. So let's talk about how we imagine this urbanization process. What are the components of this urbanization process? The first one is, of course, large population, large settlements. We start to see large groups of people actually starting to live together in large settlements that we start to call cities. In the cities, there is full-time specialization and advanced division of labor, which means that then you have these specialized traits, such as a shoemaker who can actually make shoes for everyone full-time, and he doesn't have to do agricultural production in order to feed himself, but there's enough agricultural surplus so that he can be employed, he can earn his money without actually cultivating fields himself, and he can focus his own profession, which means that all these different kinds of craft activity, making pots, weaving textiles, making shoes, making dresses, processing food, all these, what we start to see in an urban context is actually this kind of division of labor. So in the division of labor, of course, the production of agricultural surplus to fund these professions, this increased population, but also the government itself, the urban institutions, and this differentiated society, which means that agricultural production starts to get organized by the state or by the major urban institutions. Monumental architecture is a very important aspect of the urbanization process. Monumental public architecture, although we talked about Göbekli Tepe as monument architecture in the absence of the state and in the absence of a city, but here we're starting to see a combination of both houses, neighborhoods where people live, and monumental architecture in which they congregate. Usually temple buildings. At this time, we will see also development of palaces as urban institutions in Mesopotamia. A ruling class starts to appear in this context that we will see, and a particular kind of visual culture, a particular kind of architecture and art that is associated with this ruling class. Images of kingship starts to appear right away with Uruk. Writing comes in as a bureaucratic tool. We'll see in the next video, in the final video, we'll talk about the invention of writing and how writing actually starts as a bureaucratic tool to organize and control trade and exchange within this urban context. It becomes a bureaucratic tool. And the emergence of exact and predictive sciences, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, immediately we see these kind of sciences starting to be developed. We see an explosion of art and the explosion of sort of sophisticated art styles that are emerging from this urban context, and long-distance trade. So the urban institutions like the temple would sponsor long-distance trade, and what I mean by that is to procurement of resources that are not easily available locally are then especially exotic and expensive and difficult to obtain. Objects are brought in from, resources are brought from long distances, and the temple institution, for example, employed merchants specifically in order to accomplish this. And so the state and urban institutions, the temple and palace, as we will see, will emerge as these two competing sort of urban economic institutions within the Mesopotamian city. We're going to see this become more concrete next week as well. So we're going to look at this process as a regional process. We talked about sort of the idea of landscapes and the idea of how the environment and landscapes around a settlement really shape that landscape. Here, what happens actually in Mesopotamia is that in this last, during the Chalcolithic, from early Chalcolithic to late Chalcolithic, we see an incredible increase in population and a kind of a swarming of settlements in southern Mesopotamia. It's really unclear what's really happening, but towards the end of the late Uruk period, we see Uruk moving from being a small ceremonial center, becoming a large city in a fairly short amount of time. And so, and the archaeological evidence, actually the excavations at the site of Uruk, also testify this kind of really rapid development in the late Uruk period from 3500 to 3100 BCE, which corresponds to the late Chalcolithic period in this region. So what's happening is that all of those kind of really dense population in the countryside moving into this urban center. And so I'm showing you a plan of Uruk. This is as it was excavated. This was an excavation that was done in the early 20th century by a German archaeological team, but their work has continued until 1980s and so on. And so starting all the way back, starting in 1912, with some important German archaeologists. And Uruk was actually increased quite rapidly, as we see in this kind of late Chalcolithic period, to almost to 400 hectares. And so that's a kind of a really very, very large city for this particular time period. And how is this really taking place? And so this process actually, it turns out that it made such a major impact in the minds of the Mesopotamians in a kind of a really long term, that Uruk became, the memory of Uruk as being the first city, sort of beautifully built city, remained in the minds of the Mesopotamians for several centuries, all the way to the composition of the Gilgamesh epic in the 2nd and 1st millennium BCE. So let's look at the famous Gilgamesh epic. I have a small excerpt from there, which, of course, Gilgamesh is the legendary king of Uruk, and in this section of the Gilgamesh epic that we will study more closely on Thursday, it talks about the architecture, the wall of Uruk. He says he had the wall of Uruk built, the sheepfold of holiest Inanna, the pure treasury. See if its wall is not as straight as the craftsman's string. Inspect its wall, the likes of which no one can equal. Touch the threshold stone, it dates from ancient times. Approach the Inanna Temple, the dwelling of Ishtar, such as no later king or man will even equal. Go up on the wall and walk around. Examine its foundation, inspect its brickwork thoroughly. Is not its masonry of baked brick? Did not 7 sages themselves lay out its plans? So you can see this kind of really divine foundation of Uruk being talked about. So we're going to really now study really what this urban landscape really looked like and the kind of ceremonial structure. Basically, when we look at the sort of archaeology of Uruk, in its earliest formation by the end of the 4th millennium BCE, it encompassed this kind of a really over 3/4 of a square mile, 400 hectares, as I mentioned, and it's really sort of enormously increases. What we see here is actually 2 temple complexes that form the core of the city, and then surrounded by a city wall around this time as well. The first one is Kulaba. It is a sanctuary that was dedicated to the god Anu, the god of heavens. And the second one is Eanna, the Eanna precinct that the Gilgamesh epic was talking about, that was dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of agriculture and abundance. So we're going to look at the architecture of these 2 temple complexes. And in the next lecture, in the final lecture of the week, we're going to look at some of the monumental sort of some of the more sort of visual culture that's emerging from these buildings, some of the artworks that were discovered in these buildings. The first one is the White Temple, or Kulaba. It was called the White Temple because it was whitewashed with lime plaster on the outside, and it was dedicated to the god of heavens, Anu. Archaeologists believe that there are several sort of phases of this building in the lower levels, and so they eventually kind of really capped it off with a terrace and built the new temple on the very top. So it does look like a kind of a artificial terrace, or some kind of a mound, or some kind of a ziggurat that was built, and with the temple, sort of this bright white temple sitting on the very top. And this architecture actually is this architecture really is, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, really based on the basic sort of Chalcolithic house plan, the tripartite house plan that we talked about. And so that house plan is kind of really applied to these temples as well. What's really fascinating is that the temple has these indentations and kind of niches that are carved into it that creates a kind of a really three-dimensional effect. Particularly, you want to imagine this in the bright light of southern Uruk. So if we look more, even more closely, these are some of the reconstruction, sort of 3D reconstructions from the German Archaeological Institute that I'm showing. This is the White Temple that was built here. They built with mud brick with these really incredible sort of niches that are embedded within the structure. And here's a cutaway model that shows the central sort of space of worship. So it was a lot of the sort of early Mesopotamian temples used this formula of a central sort of ceremonial space, the ritual space where the altar is located, and then rooms, several rooms on the either side, again using that tripartite plan. When we go to the Eanna complex at Uruk, this was dedicated to the goddess Inanna, probably the most important deity at the time in Uruk. We will see Inanna becoming particularly very powerful also in terms of the visual culture of the city. And actually, the Inanna complex presents us a lot more complex architectural experimentation, different kinds of architectural designs that are being attempted here. This is the place where new architectural technologies are experimented with, and this is the place where we have the first evidence for writing. The first tablets, the earliest tablets from Mesopotamia were found in these buildings within this complex. And I'm going to show you some of the examples of different types of buildings. For example, the limestone temple that we see on the top right, that was drawn green. You see on the very top. That's actually a very impressive and very interesting building, again based on that tripartite plan. But what's really fascinating about it was that it was built with cut stone. Cut limestone, and this is very, very rare in Mesopotamia because this region does not have good sources of stone. So this stone must have been brought from very far away to build an entire building, and it's so large that, just to give you an idea, this was actually a building that was larger than the Parthenon in Athens. If you remember the size of Parthenon in Athens, we're talking about a larger building. So what's fascinating is that they built this building. In the next phase, it's dismantled, and they forget about this building technology. They give up. They decide to not continue simply because maybe it was not sustainable. It's really hard to know. In the end, I'm going to show you some images of the Reinhardt Building at the very bottom, the sort of stone cone building, bottom left as well, which turned out to be a building that was packed with materials, and so here are some of the remains. If you wanted to see the architecture, this is right after the excavation of these complex buildings, and the idea is that these larger buildings were used for administration and storage of within the operation of the temple apparatus, the temple as an economic institution. One of the really interesting innovations of this time period was these baked clay and stone cones. These are to build cone mosaics. So the architects at Uruk at this time invented the use of cone-shaped sort of these inserts that would be then inserted into the mud brick surfaces of the outside of the buildings, creating both a kind of a very protected surface for the mud brick walls, but also by using different colors of cones, such as red and white and different colors, then they are able to also make designs on the facades of the buildings. In slightly later buildings in Uruk and in temple structures nearby, we start to see these cones developed into a lot more complex designs with these rosettes, these wall nails, then inlaid with different kinds of stones, such as the sort of red limestone, sort of black, particular kind of black stone, and so on. And so they become very decorative pieces as well. And again, this is a technology that becomes quickly abandoned in the next few centuries. And I'm interpreting this as they're in this kind of moment of creation, moment of creativeness. They're experimenting with new technologies and moving on to others. And this Reinhardt Building, that was also a very mysterious building actually in the Inanna complex, that was excavated by the archaeologists. And as you can see, it's a series of these corridors and almost like a labyrinthian structure. Almost they didn't really want people to kind of really find their way very easily within this building. And when the archaeologists excavated it, they found that this entire structure with its corridors were packed full of dedications to the Temple of Inanna. And those dedications were all kinds of things, vessels, different kinds of decorated vessels, and little altars, and all kinds of sort of cult objects that were dedicated to Inanna, some statues, and so on. And we're going to study some of those, like the Uruk vase. We're going to see some of those artifacts in the next lecture. So let's summarize and wrap up. Uruk, the sheepfold, as it was referred to in the Gilgamesh epic, the city was designed emerges as a kind of a ceremonial center for agricultural communities. We see a kind of a ceremonial ritual space emerging in the core of the urban space. And that this kind of the center of the space is appropriated by the politics of this process. We see a lot of experimentation with monumental architecture. We see they're trying new techniques, new materials brought from abroad, and really rapidly changing, really building new structures, dismantling others, and trying new things. And in that process, actually, architectural historians have pointed out how some of the techniques, like the stone cones, actually gets abandoned after a while because maybe they're not sustainable. We see with urbanism, with Uruk comes long-term urban memory. It's really fascinating. We're talking about a kind of a process for 3,300 to 3000 BC, and about 2,000 years later, 2,500 years later, Mesopotamians are still talking about Uruk as this kind of mythical first city, where Gilgamesh ruled as the legendary king of Uruk. And so this epic poetry talking about the city itself is really quite fascinating. There's an understanding of the city as a storage jar, city as a storage place for our agricultural surplus, so that the city, these urban institutions can redistribute that surplus food to the community within the city itself. And we start to see these various different technologies of urban administration that we will talk about in the next lecture. These new state bureaucracies, especially in the form of writing, clay tablets, writing on clay tablets, and also cylinder seals that the merchants and urban administrators were using to seal documents, seal off containers of food, and exchange materials, and so on. And this is also the time that public media gets improved. We see new symbolic systems emerging, a new visual culture associated with the urban society and political propaganda. And we will see a lot of this more exemplified in the next video in a little bit. Thank you.